The world woke up to a headline no one ever expected. Africa and China, the two powerhouses of the world's mineral supply, have shut the gates, and the United States is spiraling. Factories are freezing, production lines are collapsing, and the tech giants, once untouchable, now look terrified. For decades, America built its dominance on the silent flow of rarest earths from African soil and Chinese refineries, but that silence has been broken.
China just fired the first shot in a war. America cannot win. Not a military shot, something far more devastating. Last week, Beijing announced an immediate ban on exports of gallium, germanium, and antimony to the United States. Now, if you do not know what those materials are, let me explain why this matters. Without gallium, you cannot make advanced
Today, the future belongs to the countries that control the ingredients of technology, and that bowl is no longer the United States. The same minerals that powered American innovation are now locked behind African strategy and Chinese discipline. Silicon Valley, once the center of global progress, is begging for supply. Smartphones delayed, electric vehicles halted, semiconductors at risk, and for the first time in decades, Washington isn't calling the shots, it's reacting.
One thing about China that I would like to emphasize, China went from 80% extreme poverty in 1980 to no extreme poverty 40 years later. It is the most successful economic development in history. It learned a lot from Korea, by the way. It learned a lot from Japan. It learned a lot from the neighbors. It's extraordinarily successful. Life expectancy rose enormously. Education rose.
And this isn't just the trade dispute. It's a reversal of power. Africa and China now hold the keys to the technological age, and the US is standing outside the door, pounding, panicking, and running out of time. The rivalry that will define the century has begun.
On December 3rd, in response to the U.S. banning equipment and software to China that's needed to make semiconductors, China comes back and they put a ban on the export of minerals to the U.S. Let's talk about what these minerals are, what they're used for, and how this will affect your everyday life. This is Journey to the Bag. So what are these minerals? We have
News broke like an earthquake across global markets. Africa and China, after months of quiet negotiations, announced a coordinated restriction on critical resources essential to the world's technology industry. The statement was short, precise, and devastating for the United States. Export limits would immediately apply to rare earth minerals, semiconductor metals, lithium, cobalt, graphite, and other materials required for batteries, microchips, and renewable energy systems. What shocked analysts wasn't the decision itself, it was the timing. No leaks, no negotiations, no warnings, just a sudden declaration that altered the balance of global power in a single morning. Inside the United States, panic swept across Silicon Valley like wildfire. Tech executives who usually projected confidence appeared shaken during emergency briefings. Without access to the minerals now controlled by Africa and China, production timelines collapsed. Smartphones, electric vehicles, aerospace systems, medical equipment, everything depended on the materials now sitting behind restricted export gates. It wasn't just an economic issue. It was a technological and national security crisis. In Washington, advisors crowded around long, polished tables under fluorescent lights. Phones rang nonstop, voices rose. The silence that followed the final word of the briefing was the loudest sound in the room. In a world where artificial intelligence, semiconductor supremacy, and renewable energy determined global influence, the United States had found itself trapped. For decades, it had assumed the supply of resources from Africa would remain guaranteed, while China's industrial output was expected to stay interdependent with American manufacturing. Both assumptions had evaporated overnight. Across the African continent, a different atmosphere prevailed. It was not a moment of hostility, it was a moment of strategy. Many African nations had watched for years as raw minerals left their ports only to return as expensive imported products. Economic reports highlighted the imbalance. Africa contributed the resources but not the wealth. The restriction was not designed to punish but to accelerate development. If the world needed African minerals, then Africa would decide how those minerals were valued and where they were processed. China understood the move on a strategic level. Its partnership with Africa had deepened with time, building on infrastructure, trade, and technology exchanges. China saw Africa not as a supplier, but as an equal partner on the global stage and a partner that held something irreplaceable. The collaboration allowed both sides to rebalance. The map of power, together, they controlled the majority of key minerals required to produce the technology that shaped modern life. The United States, once untouchable in global tech, suddenly found itself vulnerable. Markets responded instantly. Tech stocks plunged across New York. Analysts called the event the supply chain shock of the century. The price of battery metals exploded. Semiconductor manufacturers issued urgent statements seeking clarity. Behind every interview, every press release, every public reassurance, there was fear. It wasn't just about supply, it was about something far deeper: control. In Africa, celebration mixed with determination. For generations, the continent had watched its resources define the wealth of foreign nations. Now the same resources would define its own. Large industrial corridors that had been under construction for years suddenly took on a new significance. Manufacturing cities in southern Africa accelerated hiring. New semiconductor research centers opened their doors in East Africa. North African energy and logistics hubs expanded capacity. West Africa advanced battery development initiatives that previously seemed ambitious. Now they were essential. The shift wasn't just economic, it was psychological. For the first time, Africa held the keys to the future rather than reacting to someone else's vision of it. This did not go unnoticed in the United States. Overnight, a new narrative formed on television screens. The U.S. could not lose access to Africa. Policymakers held urgent conferences, stating that America must rebuild partnerships across the African continent. Yet beneath the diplomatic language lay something far more desperate: the realization that the United States had taken its access for granted, ignoring Africa until it became indispensable. For decades, Washington's strategy had focused heavily on Asia, assuming Africa would remain secondary in global trade and manufacturing. That assumption had just collapsed. While the United States debated strategy, Africa and China continued building refineries, processing plants, semiconductor facilities, EV battery factories. A newly announced initiative would ensure that raw minerals were transformed into finished products within Africa before export, multiplying revenue and creating millions of jobs. The world had entered a new industrial age, one that the United States had not prepared for. In media outlets across Beijing, the tone was confident. Commentators highlighted the importance of resource sovereignty and economic fairness. They repeated one core message: global technology should not rely on a single nation but should reflect shared opportunities. The cooperation with Africa was presented not as an alliance against the United States, but as a pathway toward multipolar growth. Meanwhile, U.S. companies scrambled to find alternatives, but none existed. At the scale or purity of African and Chinese supply, attempts to expand domestic mining faced environmental protests and legal battles. Exploration in other countries required years of development before production could begin. Time was the one resource the United States did not have. Inside tech headquarters in California, the reality set in: product launches would be delayed, AI servers would be slowed, electric vehicle rollouts would be reduced, production schedules were redrafted, then redrafted again, each time more constrained than before. Factory expansions in Texas and Arizona were suddenly at risk. It wasn't just about losing minerals, it was losing momentum. Africa and China now held the clock. On social media, videos went viral showing young Africans celebrating the announcement of the resource restriction. They weren't celebrating conflict, they were celebrating power. They were celebrating the moment their continent's value was finally recognized by the world. They were celebrating the fact that the global future could no longer be built without Africa at the center of it. And in that truth lay the heart of a new era, one in which the United States would have to learn what Europe had already discovered. Africa was no longer a silent participant in global trade. Africa was a superpower in its own right. What came next would determine the direction of the world: cooperation or confrontation. But one thing was already undeniable. The panic in the U.S. tech industry was not temporary. It was the beginning of a restructuring of global power that could not be undone. The morning after the restriction announcement, Washington woke up to the harsh reality that the crisis was not going to fade. Overnight analysis confirmed the worst-case scenario. The United States did not possess a clear path to replace what Africa and China had just restricted, not in months, not even in a few years. The global tech industry that America dominated had been built on an assumption of uninterrupted access to mineral supply, an assumption that no longer existed. Inside the White House, an emergency task force assembled before sunrise. Advisors studied maps, trade charts, and diplomatic briefing papers. Everything pointed to the same conclusion: without Africa and China, the technological supremacy the United States had built for decades could crumble. Semiconductor manufacturers demanded government intervention. Electric vehicle companies warned of mass layoffs. Renewable energy developers halted expansion plans. Even the defense sector expressed concern about strategic vulnerabilities. The tone shifted from urgency to alarm. Countries usually viewed as minor players in U.S. trade. Discussions now became critically important. Nigeria, Congo, Zambia, Namibia, Tanzania, South Africa, each of these countries held minerals the United States could not function without, yet none of them responded to Washington's inquiries with urgency. Diplomats were polite, professional, but firm. Africa was not ending trade with the United States, it was ending unequal trade. The American response had come too late. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the energy was completely different, disciplined, confident, and meticulously planned. China had long understood the importance of rare earth minerals and semiconductor metals. It secured partnerships through investment rather than dominance, ensuring loyalty through mutual benefit rather than pressure. When Africa announced its restriction policy, China didn't scramble, it accelerated. Joint tech manufacturing zones were announced in East Africa, mapping the beginning of a semiconductor supply chain within the continent. Lithium processing plants expanded in southern Africa with Chinese machinery and African engineers. Battery research hubs opened along the West African coast. The transformation was fast, structured, and intentional. Africa had the resources, China had the industrial power. Together they formed a supply chain the world could not ignore. But this wasn't just about minerals anymore. It was about forcing the world to recognize Africa as a producer, not a supplier. In Ghana, university graduates celebrated job offers from robotics companies that would have once only existed offshore. In Congo, technicians worked in high-tech refining facilities rather than artisanal mines. In Morocco, a new logistics corridor connected African production to global markets, bypassing traditional Western routes. Africa wasn't just contributing to the tech future, it was becoming the workshop of the digital age. This shift stirred a mix of excitement and pride across the continent. For the first time in history, Africa was shaping global demand instead of reacting to it. Yet, while the world praised Africa's boldness publicly, the United States moved behind the scenes. Reports surfaced that Washington planned to revive old military and intelligence ties to secure access to minerals. But economic experts warned that this wasn't the age of forced influence. Unlike generations ago, African countries were no longer divided, desperate, or isolated, they were organized. The African Union released a statement that echoed in every newsroom: resources will no longer leave our continent without benefiting our economies. The message was simple and absolute. Inside the tech boardrooms of California, frustration reached a boiling point. Executives blamed the government for failing to anticipate Africa's industrial rise, while politicians accused corporations of relying too heavily on foreign supply. The truth sat uncomfortably between them. Both had underestimated Africa. The panic began to seep into everyday life. Consumers noticed sudden delays in new smartphone releases. Major car makers announced slower EV rollout schedules. Rising material costs pushed up prices on computers and electric appliances. Economists warned that if the situation continued, inflation would accelerate and unemployment could increase. The stock market mirrored the fear. Companies dependent on battery metals and semiconductor supply chains saw their valuation collapse. The once invincible image of the U.S. tech sector began to crack. Meanwhile, Africa and China kept building. New African universities launched engineering programs with scholarships funded jointly by African governments and Chinese companies. Industrial training centers opened in mining regions, replacing outdated extraction models with advanced automation technology. The youth once resigned to watching their resources leave the continent now became engineers, scientists, and factory managers shaping the continent's industrial future. Africa was not just restricting. exports, it was expanding power. And China understood that power was not simply measured through manufacturing capacity, but through dependency. With the world racing toward electrification and digital transformation, whoever controlled the minerals controlled the future. The United States finally admitted in private what it would not yet admit in public it needed. Africa, more than Africa, needed the United States. A classified assessment circulated through Washington with a chilling conclusion. Without substantial concessions, the United States will lose access to critical supply chains for at least a decade. The question was no longer whether to negotiate, it was how much the United States was prepared to surrender to regain access. But this time, Africa was not desperate for American approval. It had options. Middle Eastern investors lined up to support the industrial transition. South American nations proposed resource alliances. Asia welcomed Africa into high-tech production networks. For the first time in the modern era, Africa did not need to choose between dependency, it could choose sovereignty. The shift had changed everything. A continent once undervalued now sat at the center of the global stage. A nation that once dominated the tech landscape now found itself scrambling to keep up, and China, once dismissed as a manufacturing giant, now held the other half of the world's technological spine. The era of one-sided access to African minerals had ended forever, but the world had not yet seen the most dramatic move of all, a policy. Africa and China were preparing that would permanently restructure global technology power. And when it arrived, the panic spreading across the United States would turn into something far deeper: fear.